Hello, this is Yuri Matsarsky with a new story on the Look Up channel. Ukraine celebrates its main national holiday, Independence Day. It was on 1991 that the Ukrainian parliament voted for the sovereignty of the republic and for Ukraine's secession from the USSR. Formally, all decisions concerning the economic and military policy of Ukraine, its foreign policy and internal structure have since become independent of the former metropolis. It's very important to understand that Ukraine gained independence in 1991 partly because the USSR no longer had the strength to keep the republics under control. Weakened by the senseless war in Afghanistan, failed economic experiments, mass disillusionment with the idea of communism and rampant corruption, by early 1990s the Soviet Union was a real failed state. Even officers in the army and security forces were far more concerned with their own survival than with the preservation of the state. Actually, this made it possible to disassemble the USSR into parts relatively painlessly, because the collapse of the USSR was nevertheless accompanied by local conflicts in the Caucasus, Central Asia and Moldova. But they were usually provoked by local forces and not by the Kremlin, which, however, did not prevent Moscow from taking part in them for the best of its ability, supporting one side or another. However, we digress from the main topic. So, not only the popularity of idea of independence, not only the growth of the influence of supporters of creation of a sovereign national state, but the weakness of the Soviet Empire became one of the main guarantees of the emergence of independent Ukraine. Extraordinary circumstances helped Ukraine to leave the USSR. In August 1991, a group of communist conspirators in Moscow attempted to seize power. The failure of the coup a few days later and the expected court cases against the Communist Party and its leaders forced even the communists in the Ukrainian parliament to vote for the independence of Ukraine. The Reds, who were in the majority in the Ukrainian parliament at that time, decided that the best way to save themselves from the possible repressions against their Russian comrades was to fence themselves off from these comrades by the state border. They then set a condition not to touch the property of the Communist Party and not to prohibit its activities in exchange for voting for independence. And in general, these conditions were observed for quite a long time. So, under the conditions prevailing in 1991, the supporters of independence were able to take advantage of the window of opportunity that had opened up and managed to achieve their goal without wars, without clashes, by political methods alone. It was a real feat of those people who fought for independence for years, received prison terms and were persecuted. They, after decades of underground struggle, were suddenly able to drag even the most important ideological opponents, the communists, to their side without blood and violence. In Russia, after that, they said that independence was simply given to Ukrainians, that they did nothing to achieve it. Of course, this was a lie. And of course, in Russia, there were a lot of people who willingly believed in this lie. Most Russians did not perceive Ukraine as independent state even more than 10 years after the collapse of the USSR. In 2004, a survey of Russian popular opinion showed that less than 30% of Russians were really ready to agree that Ukraine is a separate state, independent in determining its own destiny. The rest, including the then political leadership, which is still at the helm in Moscow, considered Ukrainians not a separate nation, but part of the Russian people. For them, Ukrainian independence was a strange accident, and Ukraine itself was Russian territory that would definitely return back. As long as Ukraine was ruled by at least partly pro-Russian politicians, Moscow pretended to support the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine and did not enroach to the territorial integrity of neighboring state. It already had everything it could want from Ukraine: a naval base in Crimea, gas transit to Europe, preferences for the Russian Orthodox Church, free distribution of its media, and army of corrupt officials ready to cater to the Kremlin's every whim. But the revolution in 2004 changed everything. It brought pro-European forces to power and showed that Moscow's influence on Ukraine is not unlimited, that many Ukrainians do not consider themselves Russians at all, do not want to watch Russian TV, go to a Russian church, and generally somehow associate themselves with Russia. And at that moment, the Russian authorities changed their approach to Ukraine and Ukrainians. The national organizations of Ukrainians in Russia were the first to feel this. In 2004, they rather delicately but clearly asked the Russian authorities not to interfere in what is happening in Ukraine, not to try to stop the ongoing democratization processes, and to give Ukrainians the opportunity to choose their own fate. Following this, several all-Russian organizations of Ukrainians were closed at once. In several regional organizations, leadership was changed to more loyal ones, and in the libraries of Ukrainian literature, Russian secret services began to look for books telling that Ukrainians are indeed a separate nation. From the 2004, the now infamous machine of Russian anti-Ukrainian propaganda began to take shape. Pseudo-historical films and serials were aired telling that Ukrainians are Russian people who were convinced by some enemies that they are separate nation. The enemies could be Catholics, Poles, Europeans, or the collective West in general. It was then when the real struggle of Ukraine for its independence from Russia began. For complete independence from a country that is rapidly slipping into real fascism and raving about its former imperial greatness, and which has used huge resources to keep Ukraine in the orbit of its influence. But more on that next time. See you!